Hey, good evening, gentlemen. Tonight's class is completely and totally unprepared. There's no notes, there's no books, and I don't even know exactly what we're going to talk about for various reasons. So it came about. There wasn't even a good reminder for this week's class. So we're here. I think what I'm going to try to talk about, and we'll see how it goes, is in a continuation of the previous classes, really. I want to talk about idol worship and atheism and the news.
All right.
That's what I want to talk about.
Good. Feel free.
Thank you. You find an interesting difference in the letters of the Rebbe to different people on certain topics. There's one thing reading one letter of the Rebbe and understanding it, which can sometimes be quite difficult. There's a whole other thing comparing different letters one to the other and seeing differences and gradations, and in general, it's a Jewish chachma. It's one thing to understand the page of the Gemara in one place. It's a different thing to see how it lines up with and doesn't contradict the Gemara in 8 other places, right? It's another level. So if you read letters of the Rebbe that people would write to the Rebbe saying, "I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God," the Rebbe always has the same response, pretty much. The response is that I don't believe you. That's the response. The Rebbe does not accept people's atheism, which, if you think about it, is in one level, perhaps kind of insulting in a way, in the sense of religious people are allowed to have their sincerely held beliefs, right? It offends our what would you call it? Our liberal sensibilities that the people who sincerely hold their atheist belief, they hold that God doesn't exist, the Rebbe doesn't believe them. That's mitzad echad. So that's one genre of Rebbe letters.
It's a big saying, it means something when he says that. It doesn't end with that, okay, I don't believe you, and that's it.
Obviously. I have a whole hour to fill here.
Okay.
We're on 2 minutes and 32 seconds. There's other letters of the Rebbe where you see something very interesting. When the Rebbe talks about the Nazis, or about, we could say for the same price, we could say when you talk about Hamas, the Rebbe would probably say the same thing. Bepashtus. Maybe not. Maybe not.
No, for sure.
The Rebbe would say, whether the Rebbe would say what I'm about to say about Hamas, I don't know for sure. No one can say what the Rebbe says for sure unless they see it, right, with their own eyes. But what the Rebbe said about the Nazis is that, in general, what's the lesson that you take? What's the Rebbe's lesson from the Holocaust, so to speak, right? The Rebbe doesn't take the typical lesson from the Holocaust because the Rebbe doesn't believe that you can justify or explain the Holocaust. So if you can't justify it or explain it, what's the lesson you can take? So the Rebbe would always say that you see how the highest peak of humanistic Western civilization, right, with the greatest philosophers and the classical music and opera and doctors and universities and professors and all of these things, the peak of Western civilization was the exact place where the Holocaust took place. Why? The Rebbe would say, because they lost sight of God. That's the Rebbe's message about the Nazis. The Nazis didn't believe God was watching them. Yeah, the Nazis were not limited. They weren't. What's the word? The fear of God literally did not inhibit them. The Rebbe says, and that's why the Nazis did what they did. Ultimately, their whole civilization lost touch with the idea of God as a moral. They were very sophisticated in a humanistic sense, in a cultural sense, but that sophistication cannot compensate for a genuine cultural belief in God, a genuine cultural sense of the divine. This is what the Rebbe says in the letters on the other hand. Now, I ask you, it's a very hard thing to reconcile. It's hard to understand, right? It's hard to understand because if you tell the Rebbe that you don't believe in God, the Rebbe doesn't believe you. But about the Nazis, the whole Holocaust comes about because their whole society doesn't believe in God. Which one is it, right? If you'd say, right, you could do the thought experiment if you want to get very nudnicky about it. You know the difference between the Shlemiel and the Shlemazel and the Nudnik, right? So the Shlemiel spills the soup on the Shlemazel and the Nudnik asks what type of soup it was, right? So the Nudnik is always asking questions that are not really... The Nudnik is asking questions that are not really pertinent, right? He gets caught up in minutia, right? So if you wanted to be a real nudnik about it, you could say that what if a Jew in Germany, a secular German Jew in 1931 wrote the Rebbe, so to speak, in this thought experiment, right? And said, I'm an atheist in the same way as the rest of German society, we would assume bepashtus that the Rebbe would say, I don't believe you. But on the other hand, the Rebbe says, German society loses sight of God, and ultimately that's what happens. That's what happens when you lose sight of God. And you see, by the way, that the Rebbe didn't just say this retroactively about the Nazis. The Rebbe was very proactive about the idea of like the moment of silence in public schools, for example, right? To build a cognizance of God in the American public that shouldn't fade away as well. The Rebbe was very proactive in that regard. So the question is how you reconcile these two things. That's how I'll start. Hopefully, I'll make my way back to what I think the explanation is. First, I want to talk about Avodah Zarah, idolatry. Really, it's a continuation of the previous classes we've been talking about. Avraham Avinu, that's my excuse, right? So, to theoretically connect this to the previous classes, that I already told you the truth, which is that I didn't really prepare for this class like I probably should have. You'll excuse me. I want to talk about Avodah Zarah. The Rebbe Maharash of Shmuel of Lubavitch, the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab's father, the son of the Tzemach Tzedek, the youngest son of the Tzemach Tzedek. The Rebbe Maharash has a famous mimer. The mimer is called Micha Mocha. It's foundational, beautiful Hasidic discourse, which is the foundation then for a whole series of discourses by the Rebbe Rashab, the famous Ha'umnam, the famous Tanur Rabbanan Mem Gimel. It's a whole series. It's a whole involved thing that really starts in the Torah of the Rebbe Maharash that the Rebbe Rashab then fleshes out and with his whole own perspective. A lot of people don't know this, but a lot of the Maimarim, you can trace them through the different Rebbeim and the different generations and see how every Rebbe has his own take, of totally in one way the same, and in another different way totally different. Anyway, the Maharash has this Maimer Micha Mecha. Micha Mecha is about Achdus Hashem. It's about the unity of God. What is the unity of God is a good question. I don't know if I can fit that into my lecture tonight, right? But at the beginning of the discussion of the unity of God, the Rebbe Maharash has a whole section of the Maimer that talks about idolatry. And the Rebbe Maharash there, in very few words, gives a very clear, the clarity is what's very important. When you find something that's very clear, you have to pause and hold on to it, because very often, things are not so clear. There's lots of questions. The Rebbe Maharash says very, very clear and direct about the nature of idolatry, the nature of Avodah Zarah. The Rebbe Maharash says like this: we know, and we've been discussing for a couple of classes now, that Avodah Zarah, idolatry, Avodah Zarah literally means foreign worship, but it practically means the worship of idols. Why the worship of idols is called foreign worship is a good question. It has other names in Judaism as well, like Avodah Kachav Mazalis, Avodah Gilulim, right? It's different. There's different names for it, right? But in general, we call it, in the simple, is for whatever reason, it's become the common term. We call it Avodah Zarah, as idol worship. Idol worship in Judaism, as we know from the previous classes, doesn't start because people are stupid. It starts because people are philosophers and smart, right? So as the Rambam describes, people said, well, if God appointed the sun to make the crops grow, so I have to say thank you to the sun as well, right? A stupid person wouldn't make that connection. It takes a bit of seichel. And in general, as the Rambam describes in the first chapter of Hilchos Avodas Kechavim, where this whole the Rambam's whole history lesson on idol worship is, it takes generations, it takes time to reach the point that the Rambam describes, where people say, maybe there's no God at all. The place where it starts is that there is a God, Avodah Zarah doesn't mean the rejection of the existence of God. Let me take a step back. You can tell that I didn't prepare the class properly, right? Avodah Zarah idol worship doesn't mean the denial of the reality of God. To Judaism, the denial of the reality of God, what we call nowadays atheism, is a parochial concern. It's a minority interest. In Judaism's view, not believing in God whole cloth is for a very small minority. Always has been, always will be. It's not a primary concern. It's an issue, but it's not a major issue. In Hasidus, very rarely discussed. The whole issue of actual denial of God, right? Denial of the reality of God. Much more central to the Torah is Avodah Zarah, is idol worship. In fact, you could argue that idol worship is the central no-no of the whole Torah. It's the second commandment, right? It's second only to I am the Lord your God, right? Is that thou shalt have no graven images before me. And that whole thing, idolatry is very, very important in Judaism. The reason why one is more important than the other, I hope to explain to you in the next few minutes. Idolatry is not a denial of the reality of God. Idolatry says, as the Rebbe Marash explains very clearly, idolatry says there is a God, but there's also other powers. That's all. That's all idolatry fundamentally is, right? You have God, but you also have other powers.
They are
right?
disconnected from God. That's nothing to do with God. That's what you're saying.
What?
They are disconnected, not sub powers of God.
Yeah, we'll get to the sub powers in a kash. That's a good point.
That's not shittuk what you're saying?
No, I'll get to shituf in a moment. You guys are on the same page, right? Which is the same page I'm on. Just 1 minute. Literal Avodah Zarah means there's a God and there's other powers. And there's here's the qualification where you guys both are asking a question. The qualification is that I have no established relationship between these different powers, right? In other words, I take them as they come. I see here is God, I see here is the Son, and apparently they're both real in some way or another, right? They're both powers, so to speak. They both are authorities. They both are real realities, right? In Judaism, the negation of idolatry is the realization that everything is a nivra. This is the way the Marash puts it. When you realize that something is a nivra, that everything is a nivra, it can't be literal Avodah Zarah. There's another thing called shituf that it can be, which is also forbidden. We'll get to that in a moment, but it's level by level, right? The first level is there's God and there's other powers. If you realize that everything that could be another power is a nivra, is created by God, then you can't worship it as Avodah Zarah. The two things it's contradictory. You can't have both. If you know that it's created by God, it's not literal idol worship. Why? What does it mean to be aware that it's created by God? What does it really mean? It really means that the way the person sees reality, right, is that God is the single ground, the single most basic and fundamental reality, right? As the Rambam explains, as the Rambam says in the first halakha in Mishnah Torah, right? You said this Amud HaChachmas Leda, Sheyesh HaMatzei Rishon, there's a first existence, right? And all the existences of all other existences depend on that existence for their existence. And then Halakha Beis says if that first existence didn't exist, they also wouldn't exist. So in other words, there's one existence which is independent, in other words, which is what I mean by it's the ground, it's the basic existence, right? The ground, like the background, everything stands on the ground, right? You could have a tall tower and every floor is on the floor beneath it, but at the bottom, there's something called the ground, where there's nothing below, there's nothing, so to speak, below the ground. The ground is the baseline, right? When you say that everything is a nivra, what you're really saying is that there's no such thing as what you'd call in existence stam ametzius. There's no such thing as just an existence, right? In other words, you don't take the world just as it comes. And there's actually a moral lesson in this as well. You don't take, because it's the nature of the nefesh habahamis to take the world just as it comes, right? In other words, an animal here's the sun, here's God, and I'm taking them as they come, right? So this thing seems to exist, and this thing seems to exist, and I also exist, and there's this big realm called things that exist, and God is one, and the sun is one, and I'm one, and I'll work out, with all these things existing, I'll work out the relationship between them, who depends on whom, and who do I need to pay off, and who do I need to respect, and who do I need to love, and who do I need to fear, given all of these different existences, like in a big fish tank. Is how I said it when we were learning Tanya, right? That there's all these existences that are they all just exist, right? A Jew, fundamentally, based on the first pasuk of the Torah, right, knows that first there's God. God doesn't exist. He's not another existence, right? All existences come from God. So you don't take existences as they come. You don't say, oh, there's the sun, there's God. That would be a mistake, right? It would be like saying, here's a person and here's their shadow. You're missing that the shadow is not the same as a person. A shadow or a reflection, right? These are dependent existences. They only exist based on the existence of something more fundamental. And if you don't understand that that's their relationship, that they ride on, that they're grounded in something that's more real, you don't really know what a shadow is. You've made a mistake, right? It's the exact same with the sun and God, right? When the idolaters saw the sun, if they were aware that the sun is a nivra, that the sun is a creation, you can't have literal Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah means, in other words, that God is not the most fundamental reality. There's some other fundamental reality. Right? If the sun is within God and dependent on God, God is the fundamental reality and the sun is just dependent, it's not literally Avodah Zarah. So says the Rebbe Maharash. Of course.
So if you look at Christianity with the life what you just said, it's not Avodah Zarah?
I'm not here to judge what Christianity is or isn't, first of all, because it's not what the class is about, and I'm not really knowledgeable enough. Second of all, it's a machlekas in Rabbanim themselves. So in other words, we don't all agree on the exact nature of Christianity. Does that shock you? You seem surprised.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a machlekas. Not so.
Islam, I didn't know about
It's not so simple. It's not so simple.
Apparently, the ones in Europe,
Yeah.
in the Christian land, would say, "Oh, it's shituf is permitted for them."
The Ramah, right? The Ramah talks about shituf in his pirush in the Mappa on Shulchan Aruch, and says that about Christianity. Yeah. So the ones in more familiar, maybe closer, said it's not, whereas there may be more of a tendency in the Sephardi poskim to say it is more like Avodah Zarah. The Sephardi poskim famously say that Islam is not Avodah Zarah, right? A large number of them. Anyway, whatever. So halachically, there's a debate. I'm not here to judge that, right? But I think that even the people who say that there's an issue with it say that it's shituf, and shituf is a much lesser issue than Avodah Zarah. Okay, what's shituf? Let's seeing as that's what we're very interested in. Shituf is the next level, which remember Maharash talks about next in the Maimon, right? Shituf means partnership, literally, obviously, right? Shituf means you're a partner, right? Shituf means very specifically, a very specific thing. Shituf means I do order the universe under God. In other words, not only does God exist, but I know that everything other than God is a nivra and dependent on God entirely. Right? It's interesting, by the way, it's not just a dependent mitzias that Rav says. He says a nivra. So those who want to make diyukim, those who want to be precise, you could learn something from that. That it's not just that they exist depending on God, they're actively created. There's a difference. There's a difference between existing dependent on God and being created. Created is much more radical. It means that the thing doesn't exist at all, and then God creates it. Bapashtus, in the simple Jewish understanding, yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing. That's a whole diversion here. So shituf means partnership is also forbidden in Judaism. So you have literal Avodah Zarah, where you don't believe that everything is grounded in God. And then you have something called shituf, partnership, which is also forbidden to Jews, also something you're not allowed to do. Shituf, the classic example of shituf is like Rashi talks about on Bereshis, right? That you could make the mistake and think that the angels, the malachim, also helped God create, right? That's why it says famously that the malachim are only created on what is it, the third day, fourth day, whatever it is, right? The malachim are created later, so that you don't say that the beginning of the act of creation was with the malachim, right? And the Rebbe Maharash points out, if you think about it, right, what's a malach? A malach fundamentally means a messenger of God, right? So in other words, if you say they're a malach, you're already acknowledging that they're a nivra, right? That they're under God. You would never mistake, if you think it's a malach, you don't think it's another God. It's like mutually exclusive, right? If it's a malach and it serves God, right, then in even acknowledging that it's a malach, you're saying it's not another God because it's beneath God, right? Like I'm acknowledging it's a shadow, not a real reality, right? So it's not a literal avodah zarah, but nevertheless, the Torah is concerned that you would think that this malach partnered with God in creation. So in other words, even though I know it's created by God, and even though I know it's dependent on God, I could still think that in some way it participates, right? And this is a much more subtle mistake, right? This is more like the mistake of the initial idolaters when they say God appoints the sun. In other words, the sun is a nivra. It depends on God. The sun is a creation. It depends on God for all of its qualities and everything, right? But it itself has some say in whether my crops grow or not. And because it has some say or some quality whereby it specifically is able to make my crops grow, and God, so to speak, in some, maybe even in a very subtle sense, without the sun, wouldn't be able to make my crops grow, right? That's hardcore shituf. Not allowed in Judaism, right? You can't say that there's something about the sun such that God needs the sun to make my crops grow, right? If you think about it, it's quite radical, even appreciating the core philosophy behind Shitov, right? Fosters within the person a tremendous bitachon and trust in God, right? Because it says that not only do I believe everything is created by Hashem, I truly believe that despite how the world seems to work, right, where for example, I wrote something about this a long time ago. My classic example that I came on was with medicine, right? Even though we seem to live in a world where if I eat Advil, it makes my headache better, and I eat eggs, it does nothing for my headache, right? So in which case you could argue that there's something about Advil that makes it the only means by which God can help my headache and an egg not, right? You have to have the bitachon that the way that God arranges nature and acts through nature is such that this thing has no partnership with God, right? It's really God who heals the headaches, and Advil has no say in it whatsoever, even in its nature, right? It's a profound thing. This is the level of Achdus Hashem that is basically required from Jews al pi halacha, right? According to Jewish law, according to the Ramah, the famous halachic decisor of Moshe Isserles, the halachic decisor for Ashkenazi Jews, right? He famously says that Jews are not permitted in Shituf, right? Non-Jews, he says, are permitted in Shituf. In other words, non-Jews are required under the 7 Noahide laws to believe in God and not worship idols. But Shituf, under their lower standard for their laws, is not a violation, which is where you get a very interesting question about Christianity, because if Christianity falls under Shituf, then Christianity is permitted to non-Jews. It's not a contradiction to their obligation. By the way, Shituf, even though I'm discussing it as a subcategory of Avodah Zarah, and intellectually it's a subcategory of Avodah Zarah, the Rebbe Marash says it doesn't come from the din of Avodah Zarah. You know, it doesn't come from the din, the law of Avodah Zarah. In other words, the makar for not worshiping idols is la yelecha, second of the 10 commandments, right? The source for not having Shituf, says the Rebbe Marash, is Shema Yisrael. Not having Shituf is based on Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Right? It's a different mitzvah, a totally different pasuk, totally different mitzvah, right? It doesn't actually derive from the laws against worshiping idols, which is something else, says the Rebbe Marash.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, go for it.
Why would the Goyim have a different din about Shituf than we would?
It's a very interesting question that the Rebbe Marash doesn't answer. If you were asking me, I don't know if this is the answer, but my guess is that it has something to do with the Nefesh Elokis, because we have a Nefesh Elokis, which has a profound inherited relationship to God, as it says in Tanya, from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, etc. So more can be demanded of our appreciation of God.
So you try to answer in a Kabbalistic way.
Yeah, as opposed to, you think there's perhaps a rational way? Maybe. I don't know either.
I mean, I would start with that, but I don't know.
The Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, generally speaking, aside from the fact that this is an interesting parenthetical. So because I didn't plan the class, I'm open to taking interesting parenthetical. The Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide laws, aside from the fact that in their best way of keeping them, they're supposed to be kept because they were given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, right? As the Rebbe always emphasized, right? In other words, the perfect member of Chasidei Ummah Ha'olam doesn't just keep the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach because they make sense. It keeps them because it's what God expressed to the people of Israel on Mount Sinai with the Torah, that these are the 7 Noahide laws for all humanity. Aside from that, the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach are fundamentally all mishpatim, right? They're all mitzvahs that you would logically arrive at, right? So a different angle of saying why they would have a different notion of Achdus Hashem, maybe you could argue, is that logically you wouldn't necessarily arrive at the denial of Shituf. The denial of Shituf may be a more, because if you think about it, saying that something is another God, right, is actually germane, something I'm going to talk about in a minute, hopefully. But the is really like just a mistake. It's not true. It's a logical error. We believe even within Hasidus, which is far from a rationalistic system of Judaism, but we still very, very much believe in Hasidus that the existence of God and the fact that there's one God is all something that a person can totally appreciate intellectually, and not only can, but if they have the capacity, we should understand, even though we believe in God with faith, right? It's a mitzvah, Leda, right? Says the Ram famously, right? The Rambam famously says, Leda, you have to know there's a first existence. You have to intellectually understand why God is God and all of that. So there is that aspect for Jews as well. Perhaps, Yesh Lemar, this is another, I'm just speculating, but perhaps logically, Shituf, which is a much more subtle thing, like I said again, this kind of very radical unity of God, where you would say that, the fact that the Advil cures my headache and an egg doesn't is in a very subtle way, an opening to idol worship, right? It's a very radical notion of Achdus Hashem. It's very, like, maybe you could say it's B'lamai Limin HaSeichel to some extent. It's another speculation.
When we daven,
Yeah. Yeah.
without the kavanah,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. In Kabbalah, you're
That I
saying.
do it, but kavanah,
Mm-hmm.
Here you do midat chesed, here you do midat this.
Yeah.
This you call the Shem Hashem with this likud.
Yeah.
So
It's a major issue. That's
yeah,
why.
there's a
No, God forbid. God
no,
forbid.
if you cross a step and you concentrate on this.
No, if you don't understand what you're doing, right? There's a good reason. There's a good reason why Kabbalah wasn't for the masses. This is actually also sort of directed to the general theme of this class, which is connected to the idea of whether Rebbe told people they're not atheists. The question is, the more interesting question is that the fear of idolatry that you're talking about was part of the reason why Kabbalah was literally a hidden wisdom, not taught to people, right? Because the concern is that people would misunderstand and make it very grub, right? Make it very coarse, and believe that the 10 spheres are in some way actually 10 rather than 1, and that you're davening to them and not to God, all of which are errors, right, and mistakes that actually came to pass, right, with Shabtai Tzvi and all of these, fallen Mukubalim who had all of these, so to speak, these and related notions. But we're not concerned with that anymore. The Arizal said it's a mitzvah to reveal this chachma, etc. Why are we not concerned with that? I think we're not concerned about that because the concern that someone genuinely would understand the spheres enough to make them into a real Avodah Zarah with full foreknowledge, I think is kind of lost. In other words, we're not so worried about this dar. And in general, this aligns with what I was talking about last week, that the impulse for Avodah Zarah was much more of an ancient thing and has decreased over time, right? It decreases with seichel. As we become less and less spiritual / philosophical, as we become less and less intellectual, and nowadays the intellect is at its weakest point in all of human history, certainly for the last at least 2,500 years, maybe longer, right? The power of the intellect and the sense that the logic of the mind matches up with the logic of the world hasn't been weaker for thousands of years, and it's that exact faculty which is the source of which is what Avodah Zarah is premised on. Avodah Zarah is premised on seichel, as we discussed in the previous classes. So you have Shituf, you have the first levels of Avodah Zarah where you say there's just existences and God is another existence. That's called Avodah Zarah, right? To avoid idol worship, you realize God is the creator of all. Beneath Avodah Zarah, you have something called Shituf. Shituf is the belief that there's partners in creation that contribute. Even though they're created, you can still think that they contribute or have some power, which is ultimately in contradiction to true Achdus Hashem. And true Achdus Hashem, there is only one power and one God in the universe.
So it's like shit if it's sort of like God gave up his power
Yes.
to this thing.
Yeah, exactly right. It's actually described as in a very interesting mashal. Actually, it's very interesting for modern times for people like us. It's described as like a bureaucracy, right? The king is very far away, so he has his top ministers, and then they have the ministers under them, and they have the ministers under them, like a divine Soviet Union or DMV or something. So you don't. So the whole idea is I'm not going to go bother the king with my concern because he has so much on his mind. I'm going to bother this lowly magistrate, and he's closer to me. And because he's closer to me, we have a better understanding. And this whole thing is that's how you get your whole pantheon and your whole, all
So
your
it's like
gods and.
the Stalin thing.
Yeah, exactly right. God, right? Famously, the God is called Elokada Elokaya, right? He's Rememu as Hashem Kol Goyim, right? And in the Hasidic interpretation, Rememu means all the nations exalt God, right? So what could be wrong with that? In the Hasidic interpretation, on the contrary, he's too exalted, right? God is up there, right? We deal with all these other things down here, closer to us, closer to our understanding, right? So that's all the opposite of Achdus Hashem. That's all the opposite of true unity of God in Judaism, what's expected of Jews. Okay. So then you have Shittuf, right? What about atheism? What about the denial that there is a God, right? So here's my the next part of my spiel. The next part of my spiel is that Judaism spends much more time on Avodah Zarah than it does on atheism, or what we would call in the technical halachic term, I believe, is minus. Right, minut.
What's minus? Oh, minim.
Yeah, like minim. No, minut. Like there's you have a min and apikuras. There's different categories. The Rambam.
Minim, like you said,
exactly. So that's right, heretic. So there's different. There's like how like the Inuit have 12 different words for snow or whatever they say. So the Rambam has like 5 different words for heretic, and each one's a different category. Right? You can go.
But they want to introduce other things into Judaism from the
So so there's a name. It's we all in common speech just call all of it apikursis. That's like just like Avodah Zarah became the common term, right? So we call it apikursis, even though if you're a real maven, right, it's not all apikursis. Some of it is minus. There's different categories halachically. Anyway, so it's all apikursis. It's all denial of the existence of God as a type of apikursis, right? Judaism is much less concerned with apikursis than with Avodah Zarah. In fact, apikursis is like it only starts coming up, it would seem, really, in the Gemara, right? And then in the Rambam, it's like half a chapter or something like that, whereas you have a whole sefer of Avodas Kechavim, you have a whole book of idol worship. The Gemara says that Avraham Avinu had 60 Masechtas of Avodah Zarah, right? So Avodah Zarah was a huge concern, right?
And the penalty also, right?
Yeah.
Curse is not included in the minion.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Someone who's Avodah Zarah.
Yeah, much worse. Avodah Zarah in general is against the whole Torah, really. But so just thinking about how I should order what I want to talk about. Let's talk about atheism first of all. The reason it seems to me, and I have fairly strong feelings about this, I feel like I could defend it fairly well, right? The reason that Judaism is not so concerned about apikursis is because apikursis is not rational. Avodah Zarah is rational in Judaism, right? It's the exact opposite of what they say in the modern world, right? That's why it's so fascinating to me. It's the exact opposite. In the modern world, all the big rationalists, they consider themselves to be atheists, right? Big intellectuals, right? Atheists. Statistically, I believe that the higher your degree from the university, the more likely you are to be an atheist, I believe, statistically, right? Nowadays. Whereas when you say idolater, right? Idolater sounds like something retrograde, ancient. Who's an idolater? You have to go to some village in the Amazon somewhere where Yossi goes. You have to go to some village in the Amazon, and there they still worship what?
Go to India.
India, yeah, where they worship. You have to go outside of regular civilization somewhere, right? Indian religions, by the way, is interesting. It's not so also pasha. Whatever. This is a different discussion.
My brother met some people that worship the monkey god.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's intense.
Many different.
Yeah. Many.
Yeah.
They do. What's interesting is that the advanced, so to speak, Indian philosophies do try to back away from sort of the more Avodah Zarah roots. As you get later in their stuff, it becomes more trying to point towards one God. Interesting. Whether they break through to what we would consider monotheism is a different question. To be non-Avodah Zarah, to be just Jittov, I don't know. I'm not an expert in Indian religion. I'm just pointing out that it's interesting. It's not that they have they also believe in there's one big God, just like we say about Avodah Zarah, right? So the question is not how many beings you have, it's what's their relationship to the one God, right? It's that's what that whole mimer is based on. The Greeks have dozens of gods, right? But if you read Greek philosophy, you find out that they believe that above all of them you have something called the Logos. Above Zeus you have something called the Logos, which is like seichel, rationality is above them, and that's the ultimate God. And with the Hindus you have a million different gods, but behind all the million gods you have Brahman, who's the real reality, right? So you could say, the Gemara says, right, the Gedudav in Mispar, the Gemara says there's an infinite number of angels, right? So what's the difference? You understand what I'm saying? What's the difference? In other words, it's not about the number of beings. In Judaism, we believe there's an infinite number of beings, right? So in other words, we could make paintings with a million faces and weird psychedelic, you know what I'm saying? We could do that too. If we have the beings for it, we believe there's an infinite number of angels, right? What's the difference? The difference isn't that the number. The difference is that they're all angels, right? They're all created emissaries of God, right? Anyway, the difference is not like one versus many is the difference, right? We also have many. It's not the number of beings that you have. Anyway, stop. We don't not worship the moon because we don't believe the moon exists. Yeah. Okay. So where was I?
We're saying about the atheists, how we're calling that.
Yes. It's nowadays, right? Nowadays, it's all backwards. Nowadays, we say that the atheism is for smart people and sophisticated people. Avodah Zarah is backwards, outside, the edges of civilization. I believe that the Torah says punkt verkehrt. The Torah says the exact opposite, right? Avodah Zarah, any thinking person, so to speak, right, could come to the conclusion, okay, God exists, but this other thing seems very real, and there's some things which seem very real. Armies seem very real. Right, King David deals with this struggle in the Tehillim all the time. Armies seem real. The IRS can seem real. The stock market can seem real. It all depends.
I would say that someone who's atheists are not really atheists.
Yeah. I agree.
They believe. No, I mean they don't believe there's a God like we call God.
Yeah.
They believe the world was always existing.
Yeah.
They would be of the Greek philosophy.
Very much so. I very much
call that atheist.
The
world is God.
Yeah, 100%.
We created ourselves.
Yeah. I agree with you. 100%. A real atheism, right, means, think back to Avodah Zarah, right? Avodah Zarah, we said, what Avodah Zarah means, there's lots of different powers, and I don't know what's what, and they all seem to exist, right? Let's go back to Avram, right? Avram, as we were talking about 2 weeks ago, right, discovers God. Not only does he discover God, having grown up among the idolaters, he discovers God rationally, which is very interesting. Not because God reveals himself, right, but by looking at the world famously, as all the children learn in Hebrew school, right, starting at 3 years old or whatever. So Avram realizes, basically, right, rationally, that if you say there's lots of things that exist, right, that means that you're grouping them all together. If you're grouping them all together and there's like a rational way that they interact with each other, right, that means that the rational way that they interact with each other actually determines how they behave, right? For example, if you read, I told you this is, I think, the third week in a row I'm saying I'm obsessed with the midrashim about Avram and how Avram discovers Hashem. So if you read the extended midrashim, like for example about Avram's debate with Nimrod, right? Nimrod says he's God. Avram, how does Avram end up getting thrown in the furnace? Because he has this whole public debate where he embarrasses Nimrod, basically, and he's defending the belief in Hashem. And Nimrod eventually is like, "You're very convincing, and your reward is that I'm going to throw you in the oven, right? Like any tyrant, right?" So Avram asks him all these questions. One of the questions he asks Nimrod, just for example, right? He says, "If you're God, you should be able to make the sun rise in the east." Rise in the west, set in the east, right? Should be able to make the sun go the opposite way, right? Think about the question. It's an interesting point, right? Nimrod could say, Yesh Loimar, Nimrod could say, you don't understand my wisdom, right? In my wisdom, I see that the sun has to go this way. It's like, who are you to question how I've made the sun go, right? So what's Avram's point really? Avram's point really is, I believe like this. Even if Nimrod says that the best way that the sun has to go is east to west, what's he admitting? He's admitting that there's something about the sun that sets limits on his power, right? In other words, there's a logic, there's a nature. You have to respect nature. You have to respect the nature of the sun. The right way that things should be is that the sun should rise in the east and set in the west for whatever reason. So there's a right way. So in other words, the right way things should be determines what Nimrod has to do. He can't just do whatever he wants, right?
Nimrod is controlled by a right way.
That's right, exactly right. Which you could call the right way, the nature of the sun, the nature of the world.
Same with the atheists, that they say, oh, that's not moral, which makes no sense.
Yes, exactly. Right, I'm getting there.
Right,
so what's Avram Avinu really saying? He's really saying that it's his argument. It's the same argument as everyone, by the way. The arguments are ancient and not just in Avram. In many cultures, many civilizations, it's all the same argument for God, right? The argument is that if you believe there's all these different things that exist, right, you start to notice that they don't just exist and war with each other. There's a certain harmony. There's a certain rationality. They all respect each other, right? This pen respects this table. It doesn't go flying off. It doesn't fall through the table. They respect each other. If the pen was much heavier, right, it wouldn't respect the table. It would break it, right? There's a system of relations between all things, right? So there's a system of relations between all things. That means none of these things is ultimately powerful, right? They're all subjected to the system, right? Then you start looking at the system. Well, the system itself of relations, right? So you could say, well, this goes more to the stories of Avram, about how Avram says, maybe the sun is God, but then the cloud covers the sun. So you say, oh, maybe the cloud is God, right? But then the wind pushes the cloud, right? The way the system relates to each thing depends on the nature of that thing. So the system of their relations isn't God either. And the more you think about it, the more you have to realize that all of these things have to be based on something that isn't dependent on anything else at all. And that thing, if you really think about it, you'll realize is like God. It has all the qualities of God that we ascribe to God. It's infinite, it's uncreated, it has no divisions. If something has divisions, right, if something has parts, then you get to the exact same problem, right? If God has a right arm and a left arm, it's the exact same as saying there's the sun and Nimrod, so to speak, right? Each one has to respect each other, each one has to, so there's a system. So this isn't God then, because they each have to respect each other according to their nature, right? There has to be a thing which has no parts, which is infinite. Having no parts and being infinite is the same, by the way. We won't get into the argument now. That has no parts, it's infinite, it's infinitely powerful. And eventually Avram realizes that there's a God. This is how all the arguments get much more sophisticated, but all of the ancient arguments that you'll find in Rav Sajagan's Emunas V'Deis, and you'd find in the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, and you would find in the Alfasi, and you'll find in Rav Chizdai Kreskas, right? And you'll find in the Cheves Halavavos, all of these different philosophical Jewish works, which are all based on much older arguments even, right? All these arguments are basically the same. It's all the same gist, right? None of these things can be God. There's one God above them, right? In light of this, right, what does it mean to say that there's no God? This is what's important. If there's one takeaway from the class tonight, this should be the takeaway. What does it mean to say there's no God? To say there's no God, it's not like denying that it's not like me saying there's no unicorn, right? If I say no unicorns exist, it's not the same as saying God doesn't exist, right? You sometimes hear atheists say this, which is beautiful because they bring out the depth of the point, right? Internet atheists used to say this when I was a teenager, right? I don't believe in the tooth fairy and I don't believe in God either, right? Internet atheists. The God is not like the tooth fairy, right? God, the whole idea of God as discovered by Abraham and as discussed in Jewish philosophy and that you can arrive at rationally, right, is the ultimate measure and explanation for everything else. Everything else can only be explained and understood if you have God, right? God is the ultimate explanation. I can only understand why Nimrod and the sun have to respect each other, so to speak, right? If I realize that neither of them is God, both of them are dependent on what's really God, which is beyond either of them.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you can't explain God.
The whole point is God is the type of thing that does not require an explanation. That's exactly right. In other words, I start by looking at all these things like Nimrod and the sun and my pen and this table that do require an explanation. And I realize that because of all these things that do require an explanation, philosophically, the word is contingent, by the way. They're contingent beings. In Hebrew, you would say they're murkavim, right? They're contingent, they're dependent, they're complex, right? So there must be something that is pashut and eternal and not created on which they depend, right? And that's God. That's how all the arguments go, right? So, in other words, it's not a special, that also answers the famous question, just FYI, that people always ask, well, what created God, right? The answer to the question, what created God, is you haven't understood what God is meant to be. The type of thing we're talking about is not the type of thing that could be created or it wouldn't be God. Right? My whole point, so to speak, of having God, my whole definition of God relative to everything else is the thing that requires no explanation, right? That explains everything else. Understand? So the when you say there's no God, right? You're not denying a being. It's not like saying the tooth fairy doesn't exist. It's like saying nothing ultimately has to make any sense. That's really what you're saying. In other words, there could be a power called Nimrod. There could be a power like the sun. And what determines how they relate to each other, it's ultimately not rational. There's ultimately not one thing that explains it. And if you look in the history of atheist literature, FYI, you will find that the deepest atheist thinkers, for example, just to give an example, Friedrich Nietzsche, famous atheist German philosopher, who famously said God is dead. And most people who don't study philosophy don't know that Nietzsche was very mournful when he said that. In other words, Nietzsche wasn't pleased that God was dead. On the contrary, he said, God is dead, what do I do now? Like, my whole reality is destroyed. I'm going to have to go figure out some other thing. And that was the basis of his whole philosophy, just FYI.
That's where
He was insane, by the way. He wasn't a stable person.
atheism, what we say atheism today, that came from the Enlightenment.
The modern form of atheism came from the Enlightenment. There was always you could argue that Elisha ben Avuya maybe in the Gemara was like some kind of ancient atheist or Epicurus. There's an idea, maybe.
But it probably came more after evolution.
I mean, the style of the modern style in atheism is a very Enlightenment thing. What I'm saying is that if you look at the real atheist, in other words, not shallow atheists, what I mean by deep atheists who seriously take their belief seriously, like Nietzsche, right? You see a profound nihilism. You see a profound, and they have to accept it, right? In other words, and Nietzsche wasn't happy to accept it, just FYI, right? He was very sad that this is the way the world is, but he couldn't see how it wasn't true. This is how he truly saw the world to be, right? And you say fundamentally, or as Dostoevsky famously wrote in the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky famously wrote, if God is not real, then everything is permitted, right? That's fundamentally the idea. And the deep atheist thinkers all agree with that, right? If there's ultimately no God, that means that Nimrod is a power who is beholden ultimately to nothing except himself, right? The world is a jungle and a place of chaos. And what dominates is what you can get away with, right? Basically, in other words, if you can literally make the physical fact of it happening. If you're Hamas and you can go and kill a baby in its crib, right? The very fact that it's occurred is its own justification. There's no ultimate justification. There's no power ruling the world, right? And it's not ruling in the sense of power. This is what people don't understand, right? It's ruling in the sense of being explicable, is really what we mean. There's no ultimate explanation for this, right? That's what atheism means, which is why to Judaism, atheism has always been and will always be a minority concern, because the fundamental fact of the matter is that to be an atheist, you have to escape the mind's tendency to find the world rational. And very few people will ever have for some people, it's literally almost like a disease. Other people have to go very deep into ideologies and philosophies to reach that point. It's very unusual, as opposed to the mistake of idolatry, which is to notice that Nimrod seems to exist and not to put him under God, right? Which is a much more logical mistake, right? The mistake of the atheist is to say, after I've thought about it, and after I've considered all of these different powers and realities, I've come to the conclusion that chaos reigns. Or a different way of saying it is, my rational faculty, my mind, which seems to see order in the world, is basically not fundamentally aligned with the nature of reality. right? In other words, it's a mistake. You hear atheists say this as well, right? The human sense-making ability, our ability to see the truth in the world that we have in what they would call our brain, what a normal person would call your mind, all of that is not really in alignment with the way things actually are. Things are not actually rational in that sense, in the deepest sense. All of this is why the contemporary atheist, by and large, is not really an atheist, as you say, right? Because ultimately, the good evening. Ultimately, we'll make sure the last 10 minutes are extra sweet.
But contemporary atheists would have such thing as morals.
Yeah.
Would you say that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
absolutely. That's what the Rebbe said
again,
many times.
They're claiming morals come from intellect.
Right. It's all backwards.
Which
yeah, exactly right.
That means it's not moral.
Exactly right.
Social contract.
Well, the thing is that they all see themselves as rationalists. The Torah view, you can't put in the Torah view an atheist rationalist oxymoron. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's not that God is rational. We believe that God is rationally demonstrable. We believe that anyone that's in their right mind concludes, as the vast majority of humankind has for all of history, by the way, I believe, will conclude that there is an ultimate rational sense to the world. There is an ultimate truth under which all things are subsumed, right? Even if you say that thing is a system, or you don't characterize it as having given prophetic revelation, that's a whole other question. That's a whole other principle in the Rambam prophecy and the revelation of God, right? But that there is such a being, right, is something that the vast majority of people, not because they have so much faith, but because they're rational, conclude, right? To be a real atheist is a denial of rationality. Unlike Avodah Zarah is rational. Atheism, and you see this even in the Rambam's words when he describes the descent of the generation, the Rambam says something like, then wicked false prophets came about and convinced people that maybe there's no God at all. In other words, the Rambam's whole descent is like, once you reach the lowest levels of Avodah Zarah, maybe someone could convince you that there's no God at all. But that's really like the lowest of the low.
Well, people always are going to have their beliefs, you know?
Yeah.
It's just, they don't call it like someone who believes in evolution.
Yeah.
I say, do you believe in God? No. Do you believe in evolution? Yes. I said, you believe.
Right.
No, you don't know evolution. You believe.
Really what your God is the thing that you use to measure everything else. That's really what your God is, right? So in other words, for a lot of scientific atheists, their God is explicitly the ideology that's called science, by which they measure everything else. That's functionally your God, even if you don't believe in God, in the being of God, right? Because you have a base.
Science can't be a God.
What?
Science can't be a God.
No, but what I'm saying is that they're not atheists, right? They believe there's an order to the universe. And what order are they willing to hear about? The order that science constitutes, right? In other words, they have a thing by which they measure everything. Nietzsche didn't, or Nietzsche tried not to anyway. Nietzsche tried to escape it. He was an honest atheist, right? If there's no God, everything is permitted, as Dostoevsky famously said. That's traditional atheism. The new atheism, which is a bizarre amalgam of trying to be rational and atheistic together, which in the view of Judaism is an oxymoron, right? It's very confused. Is the way I believe we would look at it. But I would like to point out that this is why the Rebbe in his letters to people who said they were atheists says he didn't believe them. Because a lot of those letters, you'll actually see, what is the Rebbe's explanation? Ronnie says he didn't just say it, he had an explanation. What is the explanation? The Rebbe would often write to people, you're outraged at the injustice in the world, right? This means you have a moral sense. So in other words, what kind of an atheist are you really? And I'll go even deeper. It's not just that they rationally believe the world should be a different way, which on a true atheism doesn't make any sense, because the other being that you're seeing is not embedded within any kind of system that can explain why it is this way. But it's even deeper. I think, because and this is really, now we're getting to really like the Chassidus of the matter, right? On a mystical view, we don't believe that the ultimate connection to God is rational anyway. In other words, or to put it slightly differently, as we said exactly 3 weeks ago, right? The Avraham Avinu's rational belief in God is not the Jewish part of the story. That's the pre-Jewish part of the story. The Jewish part of the story begins with prophecy, mitzvahs, Akedah, as we discussed last week. All of these different things are the Jewish part of the story. And ultimately, the Jews at Mount Sinai say, Na'aseh v'nishma, right? It's all emunah. It's all, we follow Moses. Ve'aminu b'Hashem v'Moshe avdei. This is not a a rational, we're not all philosophers. This isn't philosophy. This is the family relationship with God, right? This is a whole other type of thing in Judaism. Judaism isn't a philosopher's religion, as I always point out. I say it every time and I'll say it again, right? The first philosophical work in Judaism was Emunus Videus by Rav Sadia Gaon in, I believe, the 900s, the 10th century, right? Which means that Rav Sadia Gaon wrote the first Jewish philosophy book as long after the giving of the Torah as Mount Sinai, as we today live after like the ancient Greeks, the death of Plato. Right. In other words, it's as if you port it over to Christianity, it's as if the Christians were only now writing their first books of philosophy, right? After 2,000 years, right? Why? Not because the Chazal didn't have a philosophy. You can see in the Talmud, by the way, if you're a careful reader of the Talmud, on the opposite, you can see they have very well-formed philosophies and beliefs about God. That's not why, right? The reason why is because the whole approach of philosophy of let me pretend I don't have God and go and find him, right, is the opposite of the why would anybody bother, right? The Chazal is like, I have God, I got God in my mother's milk, I have other things to do, right? Like, what does he expect of me, for example, is a more pressing concern than trying to convince people who don't think that he's there. It's like, if he's not there, who spoke to me on Har Sinai? Done, Gandik, right? Like, it's the whole story, right? So anyway, the Rebbe, it's we don't believe that the deepest connection to God is a philosophical connection. We believe the neshama is deeper than seichel. There's more to the soul than there is to human intellect, which means that it's possible that the person who writes to the Rebbe and says they're an atheist, right, has a deeper relationship with God than a philosopher who is 100% intellectually convinced that God exists, because it's a neshama connection. In their desire for justice in the world, right, in their desire that things shouldn't be wrong, they should be right, they reflect a very deep soul, maybe you could say like a simple Jew in a way, their profound soul connection. And I would argue yet further that a lot of Jews, because of their deep in the mother's milk and in their blood connection to God, reject philosophical and intellectual descriptions of God very powerfully. Why? Because they sense in a subconscious and an inchoate way that this is not the God of Judaism. This is not the real thing. And sometimes when you give those Jews the real thing and you say, I'm not going to explain God to you, right? I'm not going to give you the philosophical explanation. God is the God of your forefathers. You're Jewish. Being Jewish means you have a connection to God, right? Sometimes that people connect to that very deeply in a way where they don't connect to it intellectually. And of course, the entire Chabad approach to outreach is built on this idea, right? I'm not going to argue with you about God. I'm going to wrap tefillin. That's the way. That's the way that you connect a Jew, that you awaken a Jew, that you connect a Jew to God, infinitely in this one act, and maybe even beyond that. Anyway, what about the Nazis? Remember from the beginning, right? The Nazis, where the Rebbe said that their whole society was atheist, and that's why they're immoral, right? So now you understand. There's a difference between, here's how I put it. There's a difference between being an atheist and being a godless person. There's a profound difference, right? A person who writes the Rebbe and says, I'm an atheist, but how could it be that there's so much injustice in the world? How could it be that Hamas kills children in their cribs, right? How could it be, right? This person may be an atheist, whatever that means. But not only is he looking, he's not looking. He has God, right? The sense of injustice, the sense that there is an order to the world, is a profound recognition of God. It's not supposed to be this way, right? An atheist, Nietzsche would tell you, Dostoevsky would tell you, on what grounds is it not supposed to be this way? There's no grounds on which it's not supposed to be this way. Things like this happened. Hamas was able to, so they did. That's the explanation. The fact that it shouldn't be this way, right, is in a very profound sense based on the idea that me and Hamas both exist within a system, within a world, within a reality in which their behavior shouldn't be allowed and the behavior of good people should be allowed. Good people should prosper and wicked people should suffer and all these things. It's a profound rational sense of God, even though you deny that rationally you accept that God exists. It comes from a deeper place than than the setting of believe in God, be an atheist, which you like the switch that you flip from one to the other, right? It comes from a deeper place. It comes from the Tanya would say it comes from Chachma, right? It doesn't. One is Bina, one is Chachma. One is overt intellect. One is the faith root of all intellect. Yeah, it's different, a deeper place in the neshama. The Nazis, right? Some have argued that the Nazis were quite Christian. This is also a whole debate from the internet atheists when I was a teenager, by the way, where the Nazis atheistic or Christians. The Soviets, everyone agrees, are atheistic because they're explicitly atheistic, right? Officially against religion. The Nazis more complicated. They co-opted Christian imagery and Christian ideas. Swastikas from Hindu tradition, but what?
It's the other side.
They had crosses in their imagery anyway, not the swastika. They have the German cross and the Iron Cross, all these things. And you could say that, there were certain churches that were very pro-Nazi. You could make this debate, you could do this endlessly, right? And was the Pope a good guy or a bad guy? Was he trying to hold them back or was he totally complicit? You do this all day long, right? The point is that to us, it's not really so relevant. That's the Rebbe's point, right? The point is, saying that you believe in God and saying I officially checking the box, flipping the switch, that I happen to believe in God, right, is totally belied by the Nazis' behavior, right? No one believed in the Einsatzgruppen as they were shooting Jews over a ditch, right? No one believes that God is watching them and is going to judge them, right? No one believes that there's really meant to be justice in the world. No one really believes, no one is concerned about what's wrong or what's right. This is a whole ideological, right? So in other words, the Nazis may not have been atheists, but they were certainly Ovdei Avodah Zarah.
Maybe.
Right? They lost sight of God. And by the way, I should tell you, the Rebbe explicitly says that Hitler was an Ovdei Avodah Zarah. That's how the Rebbe talked about Hitler. Yimach Shemo was an Ovdei Avodah Zarah, was an idol worshiper. He said Haman was an idol worshiper and he wanted to destroy the whole Jewish people, and Hitler is an idol worshiper. He wanted to destroy the whole Jewish people. Nazism, roughly.
Well, you could probably, I think I would call the Nazis as somebody who they believed they were the new chosen people.
Yeah.
And that
I know.
Jews had...
They had a whole series.
God basically abandoned them.
They had a whole series of sick and twisted beliefs. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is they believe there's other powers than God. We can judge God. God was subsumed in Nazism, not vice versa. God doesn't stand above and watch the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen determine where God can be. That is the Nazis' deepest belief. And that's what the Rebbe is talking about in the letters.
But Hitler didn't wake up every morning and said, I'm a bad person. Right. He wanted to make the world better.
Yeah,
according to his philosophy.
Yeah, all according to and within his sick and twisted beliefs, right? So that's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying is that it's whether or not it's technically atheism. It definitely is Avodah Zarah, right? It's worship of a worldview in which God is just one power if he's there. If God is there, right, he's not, the Nazis are still going to do what they have to do. The Nazis are a power. We're going to be a real power, right? So in other words, the question of whether they're technically atheists or idolaters doesn't matter. The Rebbe said in the letter, they lost sight of God. Their people lost sight of the reality of God, that everything actually is in an order under God, right? And that in the end of the day, there's reward and punishment, there's right and wrong, and you're going to get what you have to get, right? The Nazi sense of right and wrong, which is co-opted from monotheism, by the way, right? Nietzsche had a whole other view of right and wrong. The Nazis also studied Nietzsche. Nazis are a complex phenomenon, bottom line. But to a certain extent, when they co-opted right and wrong, rather than rejecting it entirely in the Nietzschean sense, right? It's co-opted. It's beneath, right? They stole this thing, which is not theirs to control, right? And they believe that they could control it. Why? The Rebbe would argue. Why? It wasn't just like Hitler woke up one morning and was able to pull this over the German people. The Rebbe's whole point is that the German people were ripe for someone like a Hitler to come along. Why? Not because they were all they woke up all thinking about and thought about the Jews from sunrise to sunset, although I'm sure some of them did. But the point was that their whole sophistication, their whole humanism, the whole heights of their society, right, was all in a way of Avodah Zarah. It wasn't under God. Once you believe that you intellectually come before God, right? Which, if you learn what was happening in the German academy in the late 19th and early 20th century, is the only thing that they believed, right? That they were above God, that they understood. Their understanding preceded God and determined God. The whole modern atheist mishigas about how the belief in God is an evolved belief, and it's something that comes about sociologically, and right, it's all within their system. It's all underneath their system of causes and effects. It all comes from Germany. It's all a German belief. Their whole society, in its sophistication, in its advanced civilization, was primed, right, to do what? To not be stopped, to not be inhibited, right, by a simple belief in God. They were too sophisticated for a simple and direct, there's right and wrong. I can't determine what right and wrong is. I don't determine what God is. They were beyond that. And that's the Rebbe's point, right? So when the Rebbe writes to the atheist that says, I don't believe in God, but how could the world be so unjust? This is a person who's a simple person, generally speaking, right? Relatively, nowadays we're all simple people, right? This is a person who they believe ultimately in this divine justice, right? There's no reason to think otherwise. The Nazis demonstrated with their behavior that they did not believe in this divine justice. The only sense in which they believed in it was the sense in which it was totally intellectually co-opted by the Nazis. And I just have to point out, I would be remiss, we should end, we're over time. I would be remiss if I did not point out that the height of intellectualism, the intellectual and ideological Avodah Zarah, right, is not nowadays a place I would go to rely on for morality and for knowing right from wrong, condemning Hamas, right, things like that. You see that the sophistication and the intellectual advancement. Don't be fooled and think.
It takes it in every direction. Every direction.
Don't think that they would be inhibited. Don't think they would be inhibited by God. It's beyond that, right? It's not that they don't have that issue. Anyway, so that's idolatry and atheism and Nazism and the news all in one class. All the good things, right? All right.